I don't know what day it is anymore. I know it's been at least 4 months since we came down here, because I've been scratching marks on the inside of the door frame with a flathead screwdriver. 1 mark per morning when I wake up and check that we're all still breathing. But somewhere around week 6, I stopped trusting my own count. I was sick for a few days. Not infected, just sick. The kind of sick that comes from stress and bad sleep and recycled air. And I think I either skipped some marks or doubled up on one of the days without noticing. So the marks on the doorframe say 119. But I think the real number is somewhere between 112 and 125. Not that it matters much, honestly. What matters is that the 3 of us are still here. My mom is asleep right now on the cot behind partition B, which is what we started calling the second room once we figured out that sleeping in the same 12-foot space as each other all night was going to drive us insane. Nora's at the little desk my grandfather built from 2x6s and a sheet of 1/4-inch plywood, writing in the composition notebook she found in supply bin 14. She writes for about 3 hours every night. I don't ask what she's writing. She doesn't offer to tell me. That's fine. That's probably healthy. Me, I'm sitting on the floor near the generator housing with my back against the concrete wall and a voice recorder that I found in one of the supply bins. It's a small Sony one, the kind reporters used to carry around. My grandfather had 6 of them, still in their packaging, stored in a Ziploc bag with extra batteries. Of course he did. I've been recording into this thing most nights. Not because I think anyone's going to hear it. I'm not that optimistic about the situation. I don't know. It feels like I owe somebody a record of what's happening down here. And I think the person I owe it to is him. So, my name is Owen Garrett. I'm 34 years old. I'm a civil engineer, or I was one, specializing in water infrastructure, pump stations, water treatment, distribution systems, that kind of thing. Before all this, I worked for a mid-size firm out of Pittsburgh called Aldridge and Hollenbeck, and I drove 40 minutes each way to the office every day, and I complained about the commute constantly, even though 40 minutes each way is nothing, and I knew it, and complained about it anyway. My grandfather's name was Harold Garrett. He died 3 years ago at 78. Heart attack, in his kitchen, early morning. My mom found him when she brought over his Tuesday groceries. He was on the floor near the stove, and the coffee was still brewing, and the cup was sitting on the counter waiting. And Harold Garrett, who I spent most of my adult life thinking was a harmless eccentric at best, and a paranoid embarrassment at worst, built an underground survival vault beneath the farmhouse where my family lives. And that vault is the reason we're still alive. So yeah, I owe him a record. Let me go back to the beginning, because it didn't start the way you'd expect. There was no single moment when the world flipped from normal to whatever this is. It was more like, you know how sometimes you'll be driving on the highway and you'll notice that the traffic ahead has gotten thicker, and you slow down, and the cars are getting closer together, and you think, okay, there's probably some construction, maybe an accident, it'll clear up. And then 20 minutes later you're sitting completely stopped and the construction or accident is 5 miles behind you, and you have no idea what caused the slowdown in the first place? That's what the beginning felt like. It was mid-October. I was doing a field inspection on a water main replacement project on the north side of Kittening. The pipes were old, cast iron, about 90 years old, running under a residential street. And we'd had 3 breaks in 2 years. The project had been in planning for 4 years before we finally got the funding, and we were about 6 weeks into the dig when the weird stuff started. The weird stuff wasn't dramatic at first. It was just reports. I kept half hearing things on the radio in the work truck. The guys on the crew would mention something they'd seen on their phones at lunch. There were reports out of a hospital in Pittsburgh about patients coming in with severe fever and aggression. Not a lot of patients, just a handful. The early news coverage treated it like a curiosity more than anything. One anchor on a cable channel started calling it a mystery illness, which is the kind of phrase that's designed to sound alarming without actually telling you anything. My foreman, a big-shouldered guy named Dale Kinney, who'd been doing infrastructure work since before I was born, said something to me one afternoon while we were standing at the edge of the trench watching a crew member check the pipe alignment. He said, You know how they always have those warning systems for things? Like tornado sirens and emergency broadcasts and that kind of thing? I said, yeah. He said, I've never once in my life heard one go off and thought, this is the actual thing. I always think it's a drill or a malfunction or whatever. I said that was pretty common. Most emergency alerts are false alarms or minor things. He said, but what if one day it isn't? I thought he was just in a philosophical mood. Dale got that way sometimes near the end of a long week. I told him the radio had been reporting the Pittsburgh stuff probably much louder than it needed to, that things like that tended to get contained, and I went back to looking at the trench. That was, I think, about 9 days before everything broke open. The thing about the hospital reports was that they were hard to interpret because the behavior they were describing didn't fit any disease pattern anyone recognized. People coming in feverish and violent and biting other patients and staff. The initial coverage framed it as drug-related, bath salts, something synthetic, a new street drug. That framing made sense to people because it fit a box they already had. Drugs made people act crazy. Okay, fine. But then the pattern started showing up in other cities. Morgantown first, then Wheeling. Then a cluster in Columbus. Then 2 cases in Erie. The coverage shifted from mystery illness to possible outbreak, and then to something that the news networks couldn't quite name directly, which was the first time I started paying more attention. I remember the specific night I started paying real attention. It was about 2 weeks into October. I was at my mom's house, the old farmhouse outside town, the one she'd lived in since she married my dad, the one Harold had built in 1971, eating dinner with her and Nora, who'd come home for a week from her first semester at Pitt. Nora was pre-med, which she'd decided at age 15 and never wavered from, and she was watching the coverage with the particular attention of someone who understood what the doctors on television were not quite saying. She said, "Those bite wounds, they're not normal bites." Mom said she didn't want to talk about this at dinner. Nora said, "I'm serious, Mom. The transmission vector they're not talking about is obvious if you look at the case spread. Every cluster is within walking distance of another cluster. It's moving at pedestrian speed." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means whatever is doing this is on foot. Not in the air, not in the water. It's spreading through contact, direct contact, and the infected are the vector." I sat with that for a second, and then I told her she'd been watching too many movies. She gave me a look that, if I could go back, I would spend a lot more time thinking about. 2 days later, the National Guard was being called up in 3 states. Okay, I need to tell you something about my grandfather before I tell you what happened when I came back to the farmhouse. Because without understanding Harold Garrett, none of the rest of this makes any sense. Harold was from a small town outside Pittsburgh. He grew up working class, got drafted, went to Vietnam in 1968 at age 22, came back in 1970, changed in ways he never talked about in specific terms. He married my grandmother Ruth, bought the farmland outside Kittanning, built the house himself over the course of 3 years while working at a pipe and fittings manufacturing plant in town. He was a machinist, good with tools, good with systems, the kind of man who, when something broke, would take it apart, understand how it worked, fix the root cause rather than the symptom, and put it back together better than it was before. I respected that about him. I just didn't always respect the conclusions that mind led him to. Harold spent his 60s building the vault. My mom knew about it in a vague way. She knew there was some kind of basement project happening, knew he'd brought in concrete and rebar, and done the excavation over several seasons, knew it was significant. But Harold was private about it. He called it his project. He never used the word bunker, or vault, or anything that sounded alarming. When I asked him about it as a teenager, I was maybe 16, 17, he said he was building a root cellar and storage facility, and then he changed the subject. The more alarming thing, looking back, was that Harold tried to talk to me about it seriously once. I was 26. I'd just finished my engineering degree and started my first job. He took me out to the back of the property one afternoon, just the 2 of us, and he showed me a section of the landscape near the old equipment shed, and said there was an entrance there, and that someday I'd need to know about it. I asked him what kind of entrance. He said, "To the room." I asked, "What room?" He said, "The room under the house. I built it so the family would have a safe place if things went bad." I was 26 and freshly employed, and the world was not going bad in any obvious direction. I nodded and said that sounded like good planning, and changed the subject because I was 26 and couldn't imagine a scenario in which you'd need a room under the house. Harold died 6 years later, and I never asked him about it again. The entrance was still there. I found it on a Thursday in late October at 9:30 in the morning, with my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the lock, and my sister calling to me from across the yard, with my mother behind her, and the sound of something that used to be a person coming from the tree line on the north side of the property. Let me back up to the drive home, because that part matters too. By the day I left the job site, things had moved past the stage of uncertainty into something that I can only describe as the air feeling wrong. You know how sometimes you can tell it's going to storm even when the sky looks clear? There's a pressure change, a quality to the light, something the back of your brain picks up before the front of your brain processes it. The last 3 days before I drove home felt like that. Like the world was a clear sky that was about to do something extremely bad. The job site had already shrunk. Half the crew stopped showing up on Monday. Dale Kinney showed up on Tuesday, took one look at the news on his phone, spent about 2 hours directing the crew to secure the open trench for safety, and then walked over to me and said, "I got a wife and 2 daughters at home. I'm going home to them. I suggest you do the same." I said, "The project's not done." He said, "Yeah." There was a long pause. He said, "Go home, Owen." I went home. The drive should have been 40 minutes. I left Kittening at about 11 in the morning, and it took me almost 2.5 hours. Not because there was bad traffic, but because the roads were wrong in a way I'd never seen before. There were cars pulled to the side of Route 422 that just sat there, some with doors hanging open. I passed a pickup truck that had run off the shoulder into a ditch, and when I slowed to look, there was nobody in it and nobody around it. A gas station I stopped at about 15 miles out had its pumps running. Just running. Nozzle hung up wrong, gas dripping onto the pavement, and the inside was dark, and the door was standing open and I didn't go inside. I pumped gas and drove. I tried calling my mom 4 times. She picked up on the 3rd try on the 2nd call. She sounded okay. She was scared. She'd been watching the news and the news had been getting worse, and she said the neighbor down the road, a retired teacher named Winona Becker, had driven past the house at about 8 in the morning, going very fast, and hadn't come back. I told her to lock the doors and not open them for anyone she didn't know. She asked if she should call the police. I thought about that for a second. I'd passed a sheriff's vehicle on the way out of Kittening, just sitting in a parking lot with nobody in it. I told her to try, but not to count on it. I told her I was coming home. The last 10 miles of that drive were the part I think about most. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened. I saw 2 people walking along the road, both moving fast, not toward anything obvious. I passed a house with all the windows lit up even though it was midday, curtains drawn. I went by the Sunoco on Route 66, and there were 4 cars sitting at the pumps, and nobody visible inside any of them, and nobody outside. The sky was completely clear. Blue October sky, the real deep blue you get in western Pennsylvania in fall when the cold finally comes in and the air dries out. The trees on both sides of the road were peak color, all orange and yellow, and that deep burgundy you get from the oaks. It looked like a postcard for the entire drive home. It looked like the prettiest day you've ever seen. That made it worse, somehow, that the sky didn't know. I pulled into the driveway at about 1:30 in the afternoon, and my mom was on the front porch, and Nora was right behind her, and I got out of the truck, and the first thing Nora said wasn't hello, or I'm glad you're home. She said, "There's something in the tree line." I looked where she was pointing, north side of the property, where the old fence line runs along the edge of the neighbor's woodlot. I didn't see anything at first. Then I did. 3 figures, just standing at the edge of the trees. Not doing anything, just standing, facing in roughly our direction, at a distance of maybe 300 yards. I stood there for a few seconds looking at them. I said, "Are they hurt?" Nora said she didn't think so. I said, "Who are they?" She said she didn't know. They'd been there for about 20 minutes. She'd waved at them from the porch. They hadn't waved back. They hadn't moved. My mom said, "They walked here from the Becker farm. I watched them come through the field." Winona Becker, who'd driven past that morning fast. I said, "How long ago?" She said, "Maybe an hour." I looked at them for another few seconds. They were too far away for me to see faces clearly, but the way they were standing was wrong. Not the stance of people who'd come for help. Not the stance of people who'd come at all, really. More like the stance of something that had oriented toward a point and stopped and was waiting for something it couldn't articulate. I said, "Let's go inside." We went inside. I locked the front door, and then the back door, and then every window on the ground floor. My mom asked what we were doing, and I said I wasn't sure yet, and I was trying to think. And that's when I remembered what Harold had said, out behind the equipment shed, the entrance to the room. Now, I stood in my grandfather's kitchen, the kitchen where he'd died 3 years ago with the coffee brewing, and I thought about that conversation when I was 26, and how I'd nodded and changed the subject. I thought about how Harold had never once in his life done anything without a reason. He was the most deliberate man I'd ever met. Every tool he owned had a specific place. Every decision he made had been thought through. He'd spent the better part of a decade building something under this house, and he'd tried to tell me about it. I said, "Nora, Mom, get your coats." Mom said, "What? Why?" I said, "I need to show you something outside, something Grandpa built." I want to describe what it was like to find that entrance, because it was nothing like I expected, and also exactly like I should have expected, knowing Harold. The equipment shed is about 40 yards behind the main house, toward the eastern edge of the property. It's a basic pole barn, corrugated metal sides, maybe 30 feet wide and 50 feet long. Harold used it for the tractor and the truck, and a lot of stored equipment. After he died, we kept the tractor in there and used the shed for general storage. It smelled like machine oil and old hay and rust. The entrance to the vault was not in the shed. That's the thing. I spent 5 minutes inside the shed looking for a hatch or a door or any kind of opening in the floor, while Nora stood watch at the shed entrance, and my mom kept looking back toward the tree line. I checked the floor, poured concrete, no seams that looked like a hatch. I checked the walls, nothing. I moved equipment, nothing. Then I stopped and actually thought about it the way Harold would have thought about it. He was a machinist. He thought about systems. He thought about failure modes. If your hidden entrance is inside a building, and that building burns down, you lose access to your entrance. So the entrance wouldn't be inside the shed. The shed was a landmark. You'd use the shed as a reference point to find the entrance elsewhere. I went outside and stood facing the shed, north face. About 15 feet from the north wall, there was a concrete pad, old, cracked, weedy around the edges, that I'd always assumed was the base for some piece of equipment that had been removed at some point. Pumping station maybe, or a fuel tank. It was maybe 8 feet by 8 feet. Part of the property I'd never thought about twice. I walked to it and looked at it. One corner of the concrete pad was slightly raised, not much, maybe a 1/4 inch. And the crack pattern around that corner was different from the cracks everywhere else. Straight, regular, obviously deliberate. I got down on my knee and looked closer. Along the edge of that corner, there was a slot. A small horizontal slot, maybe 3 inches wide and 1/2 inch tall, cut into the side of the concrete. I looked at it and I thought, that's a keyway. I don't have the key. I sat back and looked at the sky for a second, and then I looked at the slot again, and I thought, Harold wouldn't build something he couldn't get into without a key, because keys get lost. So there has to be an alternative. I went back to the shed, and I started looking differently. Not for a hatch, for a key, or a mechanism, a secondary access. I found it on the inside of the shed's north wall, about shoulder height, inside a junction box that looked like a regular electrical junction box, except the circuit breakers inside it weren't connected to anything. The left breaker, when I pulled it down, didn't flip. It pressed inward slightly, like a button. I pressed it. Outside, I heard a dull mechanical sound, like a bolt releasing, short and heavy and definitive. I went back to the concrete pad. The raised corner was now up about 2 inches, a counterbalanced lid. I got my fingers under the edge and lifted, and the whole 8x8 section came up smoothly, one piece, on a hydraulic arm that Harold had clearly maintained, because it moved without any resistance. Beneath it was a steel hatch, 3-inch steel, set into a concrete collar, with a wheel lock like you'd find on a submarine door. No key needed, just turn the wheel. I turned the wheel. The hatch lifted. Below it, a staircase going down, lit by a single LED strip that had come on automatically when the hatch opened, into a concrete space that smelled like cool, dry, processed air. I remember Nora looking down into it, and then looking at me. She said, "Did you know about this?" I said, "He tried to tell me." I didn't listen. She didn't say anything to that. Behind us, from the direction of the tree line, came a sound I hadn't heard before. Not a human sound exactly. More like a human sound that had been altered in some fundamental way and pointed at us across the cold October air. I said, "Everyone get inside." We went down the stairs, and I pulled the hatch closed behind us and turned the wheel from the inside and sat on the bottom step for a while, with my heart going at a rate that probably wasn't good for the cardiovascular system. The stairs were 12 steps of poured concrete, wide enough for 2 people side by side. At the bottom was a landing and then a steel door, about 2 inches thick, with a conventional lock and a deadbolt. Key was hanging on a hook to the right of the doorframe, which is such a Harold Garrett thing to do that I almost laughed. He'd built a hidden, locked, submarine-doored underground vault and then hung the key for the inner door right next to it so nobody would lose it. I unlocked the door. We went inside. Harold had called it the vault, but I think what I'd been picturing when I thought about it, which I'll be honest wasn't often, was something like a big concrete box, bare walls, maybe some shelves, cold and miserable. It wasn't that. The main room was roughly 24 feet by 16 feet. Harold had insulated the concrete walls with closed-cell foam and then paneled them in 3/4-inch pine tongue and groove. The floor was painted concrete with rubber anti-fatigue mats covering most of it. There were 2 fluorescent light fixtures on the ceiling, now lit, drawing from somewhere. There was a folding table set up along the east wall with a radio on it. There were metal shelving units, heavy-duty, bolted to the walls, lined with organized, labeled storage, canned goods, sealed buckets, bags, boxes. Everything labeled in Harold's careful block print, date-coded, rotated, organized by category. At the back of the main room was a hallway, maybe 8 feet long, with 2 doors off it. The first door opened into a second room, about 10 feet by 12, with 4 cots folded against the wall and another set of shelves. The second door opened into what I can only describe as a utility room, the mechanical core. A propane generator, small and quiet, sitting on a rubber-mounted platform. A bank of deep-cycle batteries, maybe 8 of them, wired together in a series parallel configuration I recognized from solar installation work I'd done peripherally. A water holding tank, 100 gallons, connected to pipes that ran up into the ceiling and presumably connected to the house's well system. A smaller tank I later identified as a freshwater reserve that Harold had kept filled by hand. And, in the corner, the ventilation system. I stood in that utility room for a while. Just stood there. I know ventilation systems. I know pump systems. I know mechanical infrastructure. It's what I do. And what I was looking at was genuinely well designed, not fancy. Harold hadn't had access to fancy engineering equipment. But it was logical and deliberate, and the choices he'd made were the right choices. The generator was propane because propane stores indefinitely, unlike gasoline which degrades. The battery bank was properly sized for a modest electrical load, with the generator as backup. The water system had a sediment filter and a UV treatment stage. The ventilation was filtered, with a carbon canister stage that Harold had mounted himself for removing particulates and certain chemical contaminants from the incoming air. The man was a machinist. He'd thought through what he was building. He'd done it right. I thought about the last conversation I remembered having with him about all this, when I was 26, how I'd nodded and changed the subject. I sat down on the utility room floor, and I put my face in my hands, and I didn't cry right then, but it was close. The first inventory took about 3 hours. I want to be accurate about this, because the supplies were the difference between being down here for a few days and being down here for months. And Harold had not been modest about the supplies. Food. Sealed 5-gallon buckets, the kind that use oxygen absorber packets to extend shelf life. 48 of them, mostly freeze-dried and dehydrated stuff. Rice, beans, pasta, oats, powdered milk, dried vegetables. He'd labeled each bucket with contents and a best-by date. Most of the freeze-dried stuff was good for 20 to 30 years. He'd also stored canned goods, more conventional ones. Beans, corn, tomatoes, tuna, chicken, beef stew, fruit, condensed soups. I counted roughly 400 cans. And separate from that, a section of shelving with more specialty items. Honey, which doesn't go bad. Salt, a 25-pound bag of it. Sugar, baking powder and baking soda, sealed in glass jars. Yeast packets, though those were dated, and some were probably dead. Coffee, vacuum sealed in bags. Tea, dried herbs. Water, the 100-gallon holding tank connected to the well, plus Harold's separate reserve tank. He'd kept it at 80 gallons, which he'd filled by hand over years from a filter jug. Plus 2 shelves of commercially bottled water, probably 300 bottles. Medical, a full shelf. First aid kits, multiple. A blood pressure cuff, a thermometer, prescription medications. I found out later that Harold had talked a doctor friend of his into giving him multi-year supplies of several common medications, including antibiotics and blood pressure medication, which was important for reasons I'll get to later. Wound care supplies, surgical tape, gauze, aspirin, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, all in quantity. Vitamins, multivitamins, vitamin D, vitamin C, antidiarrheals, antihistamines, tools, in a section by themselves, a full set of hand tools, organized and clean, a hand crank drill, a hacksaw with extra blades, wire and connectors, spare parts for the generator, filters, spark plugs, fuel line, spare parts for the ventilation system, a multimeter, electrical wire, various gauges, coiled and labeled, spare LED strips, spare bulbs, batteries, A and D and 9 volts, in sealed bags. Miscellaneous, seeds, vacuum sealed, labeled by type, books, a whole shelf of them, reference books, mostly, a Merck medical manual, a book on water system maintenance, a book on electrical systems, several volumes on gardening and food preservation, a Bible, a novel I didn't recognize, notebooks, composition type, in a bundle, pencils, a shortwave radio, separate from the folding table radio, still in its box, and in a wooden box at the end of the tool shelf, a revolver, a Smith & Wesson .38, with 4 boxes of ammunition. I sat on the floor of the main room and looked at all of this for a long time. Nora came in and stood next to me, and she looked at it too. She said, "How long did it take him to build all this?" I said, "I think about 10 years for the space. The supplies, longer. He was probably adding to them right up until he died." She was quiet. Then she said, "He knew, didn't he? He knew something like this was going to happen." I said I didn't know. I said maybe he just feared it. That was different from knowing. She said, "Owen, he had specific medications. Blood pressure medication, antibiotics. He knew who was going to be down here." I looked at the blood pressure medication shelf. He had a specific type. I won't name the brand, but it was the exact medication my mother had been prescribed 3 years ago, when her doctor found her pressure running high. I'd known Harold died before Mom started taking it. The timeline was right there. But the prescription was for the right medication. I looked at Nora and I didn't say anything. She said, he must have known about Mom's blood pressure before she was diagnosed officially. He must have spoken to her doctor or done something. I said, or he guessed. He knew her bloodline. His wife, our grandmother, had high blood pressure. He could have made a reasonable guess and stocked the most common medication for it. Nora said, that's not a reasonable guess. That's preparation. I thought about Harold. I thought about the fact that this man had spent a decade of his life building a survival space and filling it and keeping it maintained and calibrated, and then had died quietly in his kitchen without telling any of us the full scope of what he'd done. I thought, who does that? Who builds a thing like this and then doesn't make sure his family knows exactly where it is and how to use it? I didn't have an answer for that yet. The answer came later, in his notebooks. But right then, on day one, I set the question aside because my mother was crying softly on one of the cots in the back room, and there was something in the tree line outside, and I needed to figure out how to keep the three of us alive. Day 3. Or day 4. I've already explained the problem with my count. The generator. Harold had run the generator on a timer. 8 hours on, 16 hours off, to conserve propane and extend battery life. The timer was a simple mechanical one, the round kind you plug into an outlet. He'd set it before he died, and it had been cycling ever since. 3 years of unattended operation, keeping the batteries topped up on a trickle, keeping the ventilation running on backup power during off hours. The propane was the concern. He had 200-pound propane cylinders connected to the generator by a manifold, so when one ran low, the system switched automatically to the other. Both cylinders were outside, buried in the ground, with a connection point that came up inside a locked box near the shed. Typical residential installation, which I recognized immediately as something I needed to check. The problem was that getting to the connection point meant going outside. The connection box was about 15 feet from the shed and maybe 40 yards from the vault entrance. By day 3, going outside was not simple. I hadn't seen the property above us since we'd gone down. I'd been watching through a single camera that Harold had installed, a small weatherproof camera on the south face of the house, wired down to a monitor in the vault. The monitor showed a black and white image of the south yard and the driveway. Not the tree line, not the north side, just the south. I don't know why he only ran one camera. Maybe cost. Maybe he hadn't gotten around to more. What I could see on that camera was enough to know that the situation outside was not improving. On day 2, I counted 11 of them in the south yard at various times. They moved in and out of the camera's view, wandering, directionless, occasionally stopping and standing in one spot for extended periods. Once, 2 of them walked together for a few minutes, not communicating, just moving roughly in the same direction, and then separated for no obvious reason. They weren't coordinating. They weren't planning. They were just present, the way water is present in a low spot. Not because they decided to be there, not because they were interested in the house, but because the property had drawn sound earlier, us, going to the shed, coming back, and they'd oriented toward it. Now that the sound had stopped, they were drifting, but drifting slowly, and some of them were still nearby. Going outside to check the propane wasn't an option yet, so I focused on what I could check from inside. The propane gauge was on the generator panel. Harold had wired it so you could read the tank levels without going outside. Tank A read 63%. Tank B read 71%. Combined volume in the 2 cylinders was about 300 pounds of propane. At the generator's current consumption rate, running 8 hours a day, I estimated we had roughly 4 to 5 months of fuel. 4 to 5 months felt like a lot. At the time, I didn't know we'd be down here longer than that. I should tell you about the first week, because it was the hardest week, in a way that had nothing to do with food, or supplies, or mechanical systems. It was the hardest week, because we were 3 people in a small space who were scared and grieving and not saying what we were feeling, and that pressure builds up in a contained environment, the way steam builds up in a sealed pipe. At some point, it has to go somewhere. My mom broke first, which is not a criticism. She'd been the steadiest one on the way down and through the first day, which is always how it works with her. She's the kind of person who functions very well during the immediate crisis and then processes it afterward, hard. On the third night, she sat at the folding table and cried for about 2 hours. Not loud crying, quiet, sustained. She had a photograph of Harold that she carries in her wallet, one from his 70th birthday, and she held it and she cried, and I sat on a crate near the generator room, and I didn't know what to say to her, so I didn't say anything. I just stayed nearby. That seemed like the right call. At some point she said, "He knew." I said, "I think so too." She said, "Why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he take us down here and say, 'This is what I've built. This is why. This is how it works'? Why was it a secret?" I said I didn't know. She said, "I could have visited him here. I could have spent time with him here. I could have known this place while he was alive. Why didn't he let me?" I didn't have an answer. I told her that. She said he built it for us. The blood pressure medication, she gestured at the shelf of books, the comfortable cots, the pine-paneled walls. He made it nice. He made it livable. He thought about us specifically, and then he just left it and died and never told us it was here. I said, "I think maybe he didn't want us to worry. If we knew about it, we'd ask why he built it, and then we'd have to think about the answer to that question." She looked at me. She said, "And what is the answer to that question?" I said, "I don't know yet, but I think I'm going to find out." She went to bed after that. I sat up and I looked at the stack of notebooks on the supplies shelf, and I took one down and opened it. Harold Garrett's handwriting was an engineer's handwriting. Clear block letters, consistent size, no wasted space. Each entry was dated. The first notebook started in March of 2008 and was labeled on the inside cover, in his handwriting, "Vault Construction Log, Phase 1. I read until about 3 in the morning. I'm going to tell you what was in those notebooks gradually, because that's how I found out. Gradually, over weeks and months. And I think the order matters. The order is part of the story. The first notebook was what it said on the cover, a construction log. Phase 1, excavation. Harold had rented a mini excavator for 4 weekends in March and April of 2008, working alone, digging out the space under the northeast corner of the original farmhouse's foundation. He'd extended an existing root cellar that had been part of the original farmhouse structure. It was only about 8 feet square and 4 feet deep, into what became the main vault space. He'd done this by tunneling beneath the foundation carefully, using a methodology I recognized as the kind of thing you'd do for underpinning work, digging in sections, supporting each section before moving to the next, never leaving too much span unsupported. It was the right way to do it. It would have been slow and physically brutal for one person working weekends, but it was right. The construction log went into Phase 2 in 2009, concrete and reinforcement. Phase 3 in 2010, systems installation. Phase 4 in 2011, lining and fit-out. Phase 5, 2012, supply buildup begins. Harold Garrett, retired machinist, built a reinforced concrete survival vault under his house, almost entirely by himself, over 4 years. He was in his mid-60s at the time. I read that and I thought about my grandfather not as the old man I remembered, slightly bent, moving carefully, making coffee and asking about my work, but as a 65-year-old man with a plan and a mini excavator and a 4-year timeline, doing concrete work alone on weekends. The image was something I didn't know how to hold. The construction log didn't explain why, not directly. There were no passages in it saying, "I am doing this because I believe X." It was purely technical. Dimensions, materials, sequence of work, problems encountered and solutions applied. Engineer's notes. But in the margin of one of the entries, mid-2009, during the concrete phase, Harold had written a single sentence that wasn't part of the technical log, in slightly smaller letters, like he'd been uncertain about writing it at all. It said, "I have seen what happens when systems that people rely on fail, and I know that what is coming is bigger than anything I saw." That was all. Just that one line, and then the construction log resumed. I read it 3 times. I closed the notebook. I turned off the light and sat in the dark for a while, with the hum of the ventilation fan for company, and that one sentence sitting in my head, like a coin dropped in still water. What is coming? He'd written that in 2009. Week 2. I'm going to keep moving through the timeline because there's a lot to cover, and some of it happened fast, and some of it happened in slow motion, and I want to get the proportion right. The routine we established in week 2 is the routine we kept, mostly, for the whole duration. I want to describe it because survival in an enclosed space is about routine, probably more than anything else. Routine is what keeps people sane. Routine is what makes 4 square feet of living space per person feel manageable. It's not natural to be underground in a small space. Routine makes it feel like a job, and jobs have a structure that the brain can accept. Morning. I got up around 7, which I judged by a battery clock I found in supply bin 6. I checked the generator gauges. I checked the battery bank voltage. I checked the water tank level. I wrote down the numbers in a logbook I started on day 1, same as Harold would have done. I checked the ventilation. Air in, air out, filter pressure differential. I wrote that down too. Then I'd make breakfast, oatmeal from one of the dry store's buckets, with a small amount of honey and dried fruit. Harold had honey, 3-quart jars of it. Good honey is one of those things that can survive in a sealed container for a long time, so I didn't ration that one too strictly. After breakfast, whatever maintenance or project was on my list for that day. There was always something. The vault hadn't been attended for 3 years since Harold died, and while he'd built it well, time and inattention find every weak point in a system. The afternoon was food prep, and reading, and talking. Nora and I would talk for hours sometimes, about Harold, about what was happening above us, about medicine and epidemiology, her area, not mine, about engineering and systems design, mine. Mom would join sometimes. She's a reader, so she spent a lot of time with Harold's shelf of books. She went through the novel, the Bible, both volumes on gardening, and then asked me to check the supply bins for more. I found 2 more novels and a large format photography book that had somehow ended up in a bin with dried pasta. She was grateful for those. Evenings, I worked on the radio. Harold's shortwave was a competent unit. A mid-range Grundig, the kind of receiver a serious amateur radio enthusiast might have used. He'd connected an external antenna wire that ran up through the ventilation chase to an antenna he'd mounted on the farmhouse roof, outside, disguised as a lightning rod. I don't know when he did that, but it was clever. The shortwave could receive clearly. It couldn't transmit, but it could receive everything. For the first 2 weeks, there were still broadcasts. Emergency broadcasts, mostly. FEMA frequencies. Military coordination channels. A few civilian stations that had gone to emergency programming. I wrote down what I heard each night. I have those notes, all of them, in the logbook. The broadcasts went strange around week 3. The FEMA frequency started repeating a recorded message about shelter in place, the same message looping every few hours, which is what happens when nobody's attending the transmitter anymore. The military channels went quiet, but civilian stations held on longer than I expected. There was a station somewhere in Ohio. I couldn't pin the exact location, that broadcast live voice right through the end of week 4. A woman's voice, calm and methodical, giving information about road conditions and safe zones and medical resources, reading listener call-ins as they came in. I listened to her every night for 3 weeks. Her name, she said on air once, was Beverly. The last time I heard Beverly's broadcast, she said, "I'm going to keep this station on as long as I can. If you're out there and you're safe, stay safe. If you're looking for somewhere to go, I'll tell you what I know. I don't know everything. I don't know most things, but I'll tell you what I know." Then I didn't hear her anymore. I hope Beverly is okay. I genuinely do. Day 26. The first real mechanical crisis. The ventilation system made a sound I didn't recognize at about 11 at night, and then it made a worse sound, and then it stopped. Not reduced, not degraded, stopped. The ventilation, in a sealed underground space, is not optional. You can run out of propane and switch to battery power. You can run low on food and ration more strictly. You can lose light and use the hand crank LED lanterns Harold had stored. But if you lose air exchange in a sealed space, you have a problem that gets serious in hours, not days. I was at the generator room door in about 4 seconds. The ventilation unit was mounted to the south wall, a compact unit Harold had built from components. Essentially a fan assembly with a motorized damper, a filter stack, and the carbon canister I mentioned. The fan motor was the first thing I checked. It wasn't seized. I spun the impeller by hand and it moved freely. The motor itself wasn't hot, no burn smell. I checked the power supply. Battery bank was at 70%, plenty of charge. The motor wasn't getting power. I checked the wiring. Harold's wiring was neat and labeled, but 3 years is a long time, and the connection between the fan motor and its controller board had oxidized. It was a push-in terminal block connection, the kind where a spring clip holds the wire against a contact pad, and the contact pad had a thin film of copper oxide on it that was blocking the circuit. I took the terminal block apart with a small flathead screwdriver, cleaned the contact surfaces with the fine grit abrasive cloth from the toolkit, reassembled, tested. The fan came back on. Total time from failure to fix, 42 minutes. I sat back on my heels and let out a breath, and then I wrote the whole thing up in the logbook, including the specific location of the failure, the cause, and the fix. If it happened again, I'd know exactly where to look. Mom and Nora had been awake the whole time. When the fan came back on, I heard Mom exhale from the other side of the partition. Nora came into the utility room and looked at the unit and looked at me. She said, "How bad was it?" I said, "Not that bad. The fix was simple, but it was going to get bad if I hadn't caught it quickly." She said, "How did you know where to look?" I said, "I've been looking at this system since day one. I know where the weak points are." She said, "You sound like him." I didn't respond to that. She went back to her cot. I sat in the utility room for a while, not doing anything, just sitting with the hum of the fixed fan, and the smell of ozone from the new connection, and the quiet of 3 people underground, in a space that one old man had built for exactly this purpose. I thought, "Harold, you did this right." Then I thought, "You did this right, and you knew what you were doing it for, and I want to know what you knew." Notebook 2. I found it in early week 5, behind the first notebook on the shelf. They were in order, and I'd assumed they continued the construction log, but the second notebook was different. The cover said, "Vault Operations and Maintenance Guide." Inside, Harold had written a complete manual for running the vault. Not building it, he'd already done that, but running it. How to check the generator, how to interpret the gauges, how to test the battery bank, how to service the ventilation filter stack, how to use the water treatment system. He'd written it in plain language, clear and complete, as if he'd assumed the person reading it might not have a technical background. But partway through the maintenance guide, in the chapter on ventilation, Harold had stopped mid-paragraph and written something that wasn't part of the manual. He wrote, "If you are reading this, and the world outside is as bad as I believe it might become, I want to tell you something that the maintenance instructions can't cover. You will get scared down there. Not the scared you feel before a job interview or a hard conversation. The kind of scared that comes from having no way out, and no timeline, and no certainty about anything. The kind that gets in your chest at night and doesn't let go. When that happens, I want you to do what I did in 1970. When I came back from Vietnam, and the nightmares were so bad I hadn't slept more than 3 hours together in 2 months. I went out to the equipment shed, and I started building a workbench. Just a workbench, nothing important. But I worked on it for 4 hours every day for 2 weeks, and when it was done, the nightmares were still there, but they had less room to operate. Work. That is what I want you to do, not work to distract yourself. Real work, on real things that need doing. The vault will give you real things to do. There is always something in a system that can be improved. Find it and improve it. Then find the next thing. I read that 3 times. Then I closed the notebook and I went and I worked on the propane system for 4 hours, tracing every connection, checking every joint. looking for the weak spots I hadn't found yet. Nora asked what I was doing. I said, "Grandpa told me to." She just nodded, like that made perfect sense. Month 2. The strange stuff started in month 2. I need to tell you about the sound. At some point in late week 6, maybe early week 7, I started hearing a sound from directly above us that I couldn't identify. It wasn't the infected. I'd been hearing them on and off above the vault since day 1, and I'd learned what they sounded like overhead, which was this intermittent shuffling and dragging across the ground floor above us, irregular and wandering and unpatterned. This was different. It was rhythmic. 3 slow knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. Then silence for a while, then 3 and 2 again. The first time I heard it, I genuinely thought I was losing my grip. I sat very still and listened and counted and waited, and it came again. 3, 2, 3, 2. Irregular spacing between the sets, but the pattern within each set was consistent. That's not the infected, that's a person. I got up and stood directly below where the sound was coming from, the northwest corner of the vault ceiling, which put whoever was making the sound in the kitchen of the farmhouse above us, and I listened. Nora was awake. She'd heard it too. She was watching me. I said quietly, "That's a person." She said, "I know." I said, 3 and 2. She said, "Could be SOS. 3 short, 2 long. Or the other way. Could be someone who found the house and is trying to signal if anyone's inside." I stood there and listened to 3 more repetitions of the pattern. Mom came out of partition B. She said, "Who is that?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Can we let them in?" And that was the question, wasn't it? That was the question I'd been dreading since day 1. The question that every person sheltering in a secure location during a collapse has to answer eventually. What do you do when someone outside needs help? The calculating answer, the cold answer, is that you don't open the door. You have finite resources. You have people inside who are your primary obligation. Every person you add to the space reduces the runway for everyone else. Opening the door introduces variables. Is this person infected? Are they alone? Do they have conflicting priorities? Will they make decisions that compromise everyone else? The human answer is that someone is up there knocking 3 and 2, and they need somewhere safe to go. I told my mother I needed to think about it. I thought about it for most of that night. I didn't sleep. I sat next to the shortwave radio and listened to static and dead channels, and the occasional distant burst of something. A signal, a voice, unclear, and I thought about what Harold would do. Harold, I thought, would have a protocol for this, a procedure. There would be a right way to do it. I went back to Notebook 2, and I read the rest of it, the part I hadn't gotten to yet. Harold had a protocol for this. He called it contact evaluation. 3 steps. First, observe as long as possible before making contact. Second, if making contact is decided upon, do it without exposing the vault entrance. Use audio communication through the farmhouse structure if possible. Third, if the person passes evaluation, bring them in through the concealed entrance using a specific method that didn't require them to see the full approach route until you were confident they were safe. He'd thought about it. Of course he had. I went back to the northwest corner of the vault, and I looked up at the ceiling until I found what Harold's notebook had told me was there. A speaking tube, a piece of 3/4-inch copper pipe that ran from the vault ceiling up through the farmhouse floor into the hollow space behind the kitchen baseboard. Harold had drilled a small hole in the baseboard, covered with a pivoting disc on the kitchen side. If someone was in the kitchen and you opened the pivot, you could hear each other. The pipe was small. You'd have to listen for it. You'd have to know it was there. But someone in the kitchen knocking 3 and 2 might be listening carefully for exactly that kind of thing. I went back to the northwest corner. I found the end of the pipe. It had a small lever that opened and closed a valve on the vault end, so you could choose when to allow sound through. I opened the valve. I put my mouth close to the pipe opening and I said, quietly, "Who's there?" 3 seconds of silence. Then, from above, through the pipe, very faint, "Oh, thank God. Oh, thank God." I could hear the voice shaking. It was a man's voice, not young. He said, "I've been in this house for 2 days. I found the pipe yesterday, but I didn't know if it went anywhere. Are you real? Are you actually there?" I said, "I'm real." "How many people are with you?" He said, "Just me. I'm alone. I came from Becker's farm, down the road." Winona Becker, I don't know if you know her. She didn't make it. I've been at her place since the 2nd day, and I couldn't stay there anymore, and I walked here, and I've been trying to find somewhere safe. I asked his name. He said, Tom Aldridge. I'm 60 years old, and I have a bad knee, and I've been eating crackers I found in the kitchen pantry for 2 days, and I am very much not infected, and I would very much appreciate some help. I asked him to describe what he could see out the south-facing kitchen window. He said he could see the yard, the driveway, my truck parked by the equipment shed, and 3 of the infected wandering near the fence line. That was consistent with what I could see on the camera. He was describing the right view. I told him to stay in the kitchen and stay away from windows, and I would talk to my family, and we would figure out a plan. He said, "How soon?" I said, "A few hours." He said, Okay. Can you keep talking to me? I've been alone for a long time, just for a minute. Can you just talk to me for a minute? I stayed at the pipe for another 20 minutes and talked to Tom Aldridge about nothing in particular, about the house, about what he'd eaten, about his knee. He'd been a school principal before retiring. He'd known Winona Becker for 30 years. His wife had died 2 years ago. He'd been visiting the area when everything broke open, and he'd sheltered at Becker's farm because he couldn't get back to Pittsburgh. After 20 minutes, I told him I needed to talk to my family. I closed the valve. I told Nora and Mom about Tom Aldridge. Mom said, "Let him in." Nora thought for about a minute. Then she said, "There's no way to check if he's infected without examining him, and we can't examine him without letting him in, which means we have some risk. But he's been in the house for 2 days without changing, which is a reasonable sign. If he'd been recently bitten, he'd be presenting symptoms now." She was the pre-med student. I trusted her judgment on that more than my own. I said, "Okay," we let him in. Bringing Tom in required the most stressful 15 minutes of the whole experience. I talked him through the location of the concrete pad through the speaking tube, and then we arranged a time for him to go out to it. Mid-afternoon, when the camera showed the south yard relatively clear. He had to cross the yard to the equipment shed, find the junction box, press the breaker, and then come back to the pad and lift the lid and come down. The problem was, the camera didn't cover the area of the pad. Once Tom was moving toward the shed, I couldn't see him. I could only wait and listen. I heard him moving above us for a while, then nothing for about 3 minutes, then the sound of the outer hatch lifting, then the clunk of the wheel mechanism turning. Then Tom Aldridge came down the stairs. He was a thin, white-haired man with glasses and a gray cardigan sweater, and he was shaking hard enough that I could see it from 5 feet away. He got to the bottom of the stairs, and he stood there, and he looked at the vault, and then he looked at me. He said, "Your grandfather built this?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I knew Harold Garrett for 15 years. He never once mentioned it." That sentence landed strange. I looked at him and I said, "You knew him?" He said, "We were in a Tuesday morning coffee group together. Him, me, Wallace Pruitt, and a few others. Every Tuesday at the diner on Main Street in town, for years. And there was that name, Wallace Pruitt. I didn't know why that name meant anything to me yet. I'd find out later. Tom Aldridge was not a difficult house guest, if you can call someone sharing your underground survival vault a house guest. He was quiet and grateful, and he had genuinely good manners that somehow made the cramped space more livable rather than less. He ate whatever we put in front of him without comment. He helped without being asked. He slept on one of the folding cots in Partition B, and he was up before everyone except me, and he spent his mornings reading Harold's shelf of books. His knee was bad. An old injury, surgery several years back, and the cold concrete was hard on it. We gave him one of the anti-fatigue mats to stand on when he was working, and he accepted it without a lot of fuss. The fourth morning he was with us. We sat together after breakfast, and I told him what I knew so far about the vault and what I'd found in the notebooks. He listened carefully. Then he said, "Harold built this because of what happened at the plant." I said, "What plant?" He looked at me for a second. Then he said, "You don't know." I said, "I don't know." He said, "Harold worked at that pipe fittings plant for 30 years. You know that. What you may not know is that in the early 1980s, that plant had a government contract, defense contract. Harold never told you?" I said, "He never talked about work much." Tom nodded slowly. He said, "The plant manufactured components for..." He paused. He said, "I'm going to be careful here, because I'm telling you what Harold told me, and Harold was careful about what he said, and I want to honor that. The components were for containment systems, specifically for storage and transport of biological materials. See, government labs. The kind of labs that don't appear on standard facility listings." I said, "Bioweapons." He said, "Harold didn't use that word. He said defensive research, but he said the lines between defensive and offensive in that program were..." He looked for the word, "thin." He said the margins were thin, and he said he'd seen things in the component specifications that scared him. Things about containment breach scenarios, what they planned for, if a containment breach happened. I was very quiet. He said, "Harold retired from that plant in 1999, about 5 years after the government contract ended. But he never stopped thinking about what he'd seen. When 2001 happened, and the anthrax letters and all of that, he got more concerned. He started this project in 2008, which was after something happened that he mentioned once, only once, and then never again. He said a former colleague had sent him a letter about the program, about something that had happened in the research that nobody was talking about." I said, "Wallace Pruitt." Tom looked at me sharply. He said, "Where did you hear that name?" I said, "You mentioned him." "Tuesday Coffee Group." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wallace Pruitt was that colleague. And yes, Wallace was in our Tuesday group for a while. He stopped coming about 2 years ago, said he was in poor health. But I don't think it was poor health." I said, "What do you think it was?" He said, "I think Wallace found out something more than Harold knew. And I think Harold was afraid that Wallace talking to the wrong people might..." He trailed off. He said, "You have your grandfather's notes. Have you found the third notebook yet?" I said I'd found 2. He said, "There's a third. Harold told me, once, after more coffee than he usually had, that there was a third notebook he'd put somewhere in the vault that he didn't put with the others. He said it was for someone who needed to know the whole thing, and he wasn't sure anyone ever would." I looked at the shelves. I looked at the supply bins. I looked at the partition walls and the floor and the ceiling. I found it 3 days later. The third notebook was inside the wall. The pine tongue and groove paneling on the east wall. I found it when I was doing a detailed check of the wall panels for any signs of moisture intrusion, which is a real concern in a below-grade concrete space. One panel, fourth from the south end, second from the floor, had a very slightly different sound when I knocked on it. Not hollow exactly, but different. I pressed along the bottom edge and felt a slight gap. I pressed harder, and the panel pivoted inward on a concealed hinge at the top, revealing a space behind it, about 6 inches deep and 2 feet wide. Inside the space, the third notebook, sealed in a Ziploc bag. A small shortwave transmitter, a handheld one, battery-powered, with a note taped to it that said, "Transmit only if everything else has failed." A manila folder sealed with tape, and a photograph. The photograph was of Harold and another man, both looking considerably younger than I ever saw Harold. Maybe in their 30s, standing in front of an industrial building I didn't recognize, both in work clothes. Harold was grinning, which was unusual. Harold was not a grinning man as a rule. The other man was shorter, darker-haired, serious-faced. On the back, in Harold's handwriting, "Wally and me, Building C, October 1981. Wally, Wallace Pruitt." I took the folder and the notebook and the photograph back to the table, and I sat down, and Tom Aldridge came over and sat across from me, and Nora sat next to me, and my mother stood nearby. I opened the folder. Inside was a letter. 8 pages, typed, no letterhead, dated January of 2008, addressed to Harold by name. The letter was from Wallace Pruitt. I'm going to summarize what it said, because reading the full letter took me most of an evening, and some parts of it are technical, in ways that took me a long time to parse. But the core of it was this. Wallace Pruitt had spent the years after the plant contract working for a consulting firm that had ongoing relationships with several government research programs. In that capacity, he had learned, gradually over the following decade, that the containment systems he and Harold had helped manufacture components for were part of a program studying a pathogen, a specific pathogen, developed as part of a broader biological research initiative, one that had been technically discontinued after certain treaties in the 1990s, but that had continued unofficially in reduced form. Wallace said that the discontinued pathogen, he referred to it throughout only as the material, had not been destroyed. It had been archived. There were 3 archive sites. One of them was a research facility in western Pennsylvania. He said that in 2006, during a routine inspection, a containment anomaly had been logged and quickly declared resolved. He didn't believe it had been resolved. He had evidence, in the form of internal communications he'd obtained through sources he didn't specify, that the anomaly had been classified and buried rather than actually addressed. And he said that whatever had been in containment was designed to spread through direct contact, to cause severe behavioral changes in its host, and to be extremely durable in the environment. He said to Harold, "I know you remember what the containment breach scenario planning looked like. You saw the same specifications I did. If the material gets out, and I believe it already has in a limited way that they're managing, what comes next is what we modeled. I am telling you because you are one of 3 people I trust completely, and because you always planned ahead, and because you have land and skills, and I believe you are in a better position than most to survive what I think is coming. Then, I want you to know that I am not sending this letter to frighten you. I am sending it because I need someone to know. My health is not good. I do not expect to survive whatever form this takes when it eventually escapes control. But someone should know. Someone should have the information. When this is over, and I believe it will be over, eventually, these things always end, because human systems always eventually adapt. Someone will need to understand what happened and why." He enclosed with the letter a list of 3 names and addresses. People who were, according to Wallace, either connected to the program's history or to organized preparation efforts in western Pennsylvania. People who, if the worst happened, might be survivors worth finding. One of the names was a man in western Pennsylvania, a farming cooperative in Clarion County, about 30 miles north of us. The name was Ray Colton. I read that letter twice before I let Nora read it. Then I went and sat with my back against the pine paneling, and I looked at the ceiling for a long time. There's a thing that happens when you get information that simultaneously explains everything and changes everything. It doesn't feel like an answer. It feels like the ground shifting under a building you thought was stable. For a while, you just sit there and register the new grade. Harold hadn't built this vault because he was paranoid. Harold had built it because a man he'd worked with and trusted had sent him a letter explaining that a pathogen they'd both manufactured components for was potentially loose in the world, and that the scenario models they'd seen in the 1980s were what the future was going to look like. He'd built it not out of general fear, out of specific knowledge. And he'd been right. I looked at Tom Aldridge and I said, "Do you know anything about a man named Ray Colton, farming cooperative in Clarion County?" Tom thought for a moment, then he said, "I've heard the name. Harold mentioned him once, said he was a capable man who'd been doing sensible things for the community. He said it in a way that made me think they'd met." I said, "I think Harold might have reached out to him. I think Harold built a network of people. Not a grand thing, not an organization, just a few people he trusted, who each knew something different, and who he connected to each other in small ways." Tom said, "That sounds like Harold. He was always very careful about relationships. He believed strongly in what he called connective tissue between people." Connective tissue. That sounded right. I thought about the list in the letter. 3 names. Ray Colton in Clarion County. A woman named Donna Reardon in Kittening, described as a nurse practitioner and long-term prepper with considerable medical supply stores. And a third name, someone Harold called the Radio Man, described as running a shortwave relay station somewhere in the hills east of Kittening. The Radio Man. Beverly's broadcast had come from the east. I thought about that. I went to the shortwave receiver, and I started scanning frequencies more methodically than I had been. Month 3. This is where things got complicated. We found the radio transmission on a Thursday night, 11:30, on a frequency I hadn't checked before. Not because I'd been lax, but because it was in a range I'd mentally categorized as inactive, based on the first few weeks of scanning. I came back to it almost by accident. A voice, male, reading out what sounded like a daily situation report. Calm, measured, mentioned road conditions on Route 422, mentioned the condition of several specific locations in and around Kittening, mentioned a water source in the south part of town that was confirmed clean. He gave a time for the next broadcast, 7 a.m. the following morning. He gave a frequency for response transmissions. He said the group at the farmstead was open to contact from any verified survivor group. The farmstead. Clarion County was farmland. Ray Colton ran a farming cooperative. I said to Nora, this might be it. She said, it could also be anything. She was right. The third notebook had warned about this too. Harold, in the last section, had written specifically about radio communications and the risk of using them carelessly. He wrote, in a collapse scenario, a broadcast claiming to offer safety can be genuine, or it can be a method of drawing out people who are hiding. You cannot know which from the transmission alone. What you can do is listen for inconsistencies. An honest community broadcasts information that is useful to others, regardless of whether they respond. A deceptive one asks for your location. We listened to the 7 a.m. broadcast the next morning, then the one after that. We listened for 5 days before we considered transmitting anything. The broadcasts were consistent. The information they shared was specific and verifiable. We cross-checked road condition reports against what I'd seen on the camera before going underground, and they matched the general pattern I'd expect. The man's voice was the same man every time, which suggested a stable situation rather than a crisis. He mentioned other survivor groups by description, not name, which was the kind of privacy-conscious behavior you'd expect from a trustworthy operation. On the 6th day, Nora said, I think we should respond. Mom said, I agree. I said, not yet. Nora said, why not? I said, because Harold's third notebook says the risk isn't the broadcast. The risk is what happens after you identify yourself. If this is a threat, they're not going to know we're here until we tell them where we are. And once we tell them where we are, we can't untell them. That quieted the conversation. Tom, who had been listening from his cot, said, Harold also said that isolation beyond a certain point becomes its own threat, that the vault was meant to be a temporary measure, not a permanent one, that no group of people can survive indefinitely alone underground. I looked at him. He said, he told me that in our Tuesday coffee group, sometime in the year before he died. I didn't know what he was talking about at the time. He said he'd built something that could keep a family safe for a while, but he'd always intended it as a bridge, not a destination. He was very clear about that. A bridge, not a destination. I went back to the third notebook, and I found the section I'd been mentally skimming, because it was near the end, and I'd been focusing on the Wallace Pruitt material. Harold had written, in the last 10 pages, something he called final instructions. He'd started it with, if you're reading this section, you've been down here long enough that you've probably started asking what comes next. That's the right question. Here is what I think comes next. And then he'd laid out, in the same methodical block letter style he used for everything, a plan for emergence. Not an immediate emergence, a staged one. He described how to assess conditions above ground before coming out, what to bring, where to go first, how to make contact with other survivors if contact was appropriate. And at the end of the final instructions, He'd written one more thing that I read 3 times and then showed to Nora and Tom. He'd written, "I have given some thought to what will exist after a collapse of this kind, and I believe human communities will reform relatively quickly in stable areas. People are, in my experience, better at organizing in a crisis than they are at preventing one. By the time you come out, there will be something to come out to. Find it. The vault gave you time. Use the time. When you emerge, you will have skills and supplies that others need. Trade them. Contribute. Don't disappear back into hiding." The vault was never supposed to be forever. He'd signed it with his name, Harold James Garrett. And then, below his name, he'd added a single line. "I'm sorry, I wasn't better at saying things directly while I was alive. I was always better at building things than at talking about them. I hope this is useful." I sat at the table for a long time after reading that. I didn't cry then either, but I understood, for the first time, the complete shape of my grandfather. Not the old man I remembered from holidays and Tuesday breakfasts and the occasional Sunday visit. The actual man. What he'd known. What he'd feared. What he'd spent the last decades of his life doing about it. He hadn't been paranoid. He'd been one of maybe a handful of people who'd known, specifically, what was coming. And he'd spent his limited time and resources trying to make sure that at least a small corner of the world could survive it. And he'd been too private, or too careful, or just too Harold to explain any of that to the people he loved while he was alive. "I'm sorry I wasn't better at saying things directly while I was alive." "Me too, Grandpa. Me too." But before any of that, before we started seriously planning emergence, something happened in month 3 that I haven't gotten to yet. The farmhouse burned. Not from the infected. They can't do that. They can't open a gas valve. They can't light a match. They don't think. They just move toward sound and contact and do what they do, which is straightforward and terrible in its simplicity. Whatever burned the farmhouse did it deliberately. I know it was deliberate because of the sequence. I was watching the camera at around 2 in the afternoon when a figure came into the south yard. A person, moving with purpose and direction, not the wandering drift of the infected. This person was wearing dark clothing and carrying something. They went to the south wall of the farmhouse, spent about 3 minutes there, and then walked quickly back across the yard and disappeared from camera view. About 10 minutes later, I smelled smoke. The smoke came down through every crack and joint in the ceiling above us. The vault was well sealed, but it wasn't airtight above ground, and smoke gets through anything. I could smell it before I registered what I was smelling, and then I registered it and my stomach dropped. I said, "Everyone into the back room, now." I went to the utility room and I looked at the ventilation intake. The intake pulled air from outside, through a buried pipe that opened about 30 feet from the farmhouse near the equipment shed. The smoke smell was coming through the structure gaps above us, not through the ventilation, which meant the ventilation was still drawing clean air from outside. But if the fire spread, that intake pipe could be compromised. I made a decision. I closed the ventilation intake valve. Harold had designed one for exactly this kind of situation, and I switched the system to recirculation mode, which meant we were breathing the same air in a closed loop, with the carbon filter scrubbing CO2. We had probably 3 to 4 hours in recirculation before CO2 built up to concerning levels. Then I sat and waited and watched the camera. The camera view was filling with smoke. I could see the south wall of the house with flames visible at the corner. Whoever had done this had started the fire at the corner where the house was driest, the old wood of the original structure, decades old. It caught fast. The camera view went completely gray with smoke within 20 minutes. Then the camera went dark. The connection severed. Probably the wire burned through. We were flying blind. I sat with Nora and Mom and Tom in the back room, and we listened. We could hear the fire through the concrete. Not loudly, but clearly. A deep, low crackling, and then occasional pops that I recognized as structural elements failing. The smell intensified for a while, and then gradually decreased as the fire burned through what was above us. The vault ceiling above us was reinforced concrete. The farmhouse structure was not attached to the vault structure. Harold had built the vault as a structurally independent unit, which I'd noted when I first explored the construction log. If the house burned down to the slab, it would burn down onto and around the vault entrance, but not into it. That turned out to be correct. After about 4 hours, the smell had faded to char and wet ash, and the structural sounds above had stopped. We were intact. But the farmhouse was gone. And whoever had burned it, deliberately, with us almost certainly inside for all they'd known, was still out there. I don't think I slept that night. I lay on my cot, and I stared at the concrete ceiling, and I thought about the person in dark clothes carrying something across the south yard, moving with purpose, not infected. A person who'd burned my grandfather's farmhouse with, as far as they'd known, people inside it. The Wallace Pruitt letter mentioned that Harold had been careful, that Harold had been afraid that certain people becoming aware of the vault's existence might cause problems. I'd read that part, and I'd registered it abstractly, as historical context. It didn't feel abstract anymore. Someone knew about this property. Someone had come here deliberately. Someone had tried to make sure no one came out of this house alive. I thought about the third notebook and the list of names, and the note about not trusting unknown radio contacts. I thought about the broadcast I'd been listening to for 5 days. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else and I made coffee. Harold had real coffee, vacuum sealed. It was one of the single greatest gifts anyone has ever given me. And I sat at the table, and I listened to the 7 a.m. broadcast. The usual format: road conditions, supply report, weather observation. Then the man's voice, same measured calm, said something new. He said, "We have become aware that a group of individuals has been moving through the Route 422 corridor, attempting to locate isolated survivor caches. They are presenting as rescue personnel. They are not. If you have made contact with any group identifying itself as the Western PA Relief Cooperative, do not share your location. Repeat, do not share location with anyone identifying as the Western PA Relief Cooperative." I wrote that down. Then he said, "To any groups that have been hesitating to make contact with us, we understand the caution. We're going to start broadcasting a specific identifier that you can use to confirm our legitimacy. The code phrase is this: Harold knew the right people." I sat very still. I said, very quietly, to nobody, "You have got to be kidding me." Harold knew the right people. I looked at the transmitter Harold had left in the wall space, the one with the note taped to it that said, "Transmit only if everything else has failed." I looked at that note for a while. Then I thought, the farmhouse is gone. The entrance to the vault, which used to be hidden under a concrete pad near an equipment shed, is now covered by the debris of a burned structure. Getting out, which we were going to have to do eventually, was going to be harder. Finding someone to help was going to be necessary. I thought, Harold said this transmitter is for when everything else has failed. The farmhouse had burned. Someone had deliberately tried to kill us. We were underground with diminishing supplies and a ventilation system running on propane that had a finite timeline. I turned on the transmitter. I keyed the transmit button and I said, "Harold knew the right people. My name is Owen Garrett. I'm Harold Garrett's grandson. We're in the vault he built. We are 4 people and we are safe, but we need assistance. We're on the Garrett property outside Kittening. The farmhouse above us was burned approximately 17 hours ago." Static. Then, "Owen, copy that loud and clear. We have been hoping to hear from the Garrett property. Give me a supply status." I gave him a supply status. He said, "We are going to come to you. It's going to take 2 days to arrange a safe approach. Stay down. Do not open the vault for anyone until you hear the following phrase at your speaking tube: 3 nails and a plumb line." Can you confirm you heard that? I said, 3 nails and a plumb line. Confirmed. He said, "Harold was a good man. I'm glad someone made it." I keyed off the transmitter. I looked at the ceiling for a while. I went and woke up Nora and Tom, and Mom and I told them what had just happened. Tom said, "Harold knew the right people." I said, "Yeah." He said, "That's funny. He really was better at building things than talking." I almost laughed. Not almost. I did laugh. A short one, and Nora looked at me like I might be losing it, and I said I was fine. I was genuinely fine. The 2 days waiting for rescue was, I think, the hardest stretch psychologically. Not because of resource concerns. We were okay on supplies still. The CO2 had never gotten dangerous. The ventilation was back on external draw because the fire had long since burned out. Psychologically, it was hard because we had an endpoint in sight. Before we had the radio contact, we existed in a kind of flat eternal present, where the only thing that mattered was what was happening in the vault right now. The end of the vault period was a theoretical concept, not something with a real time attached to it. Once we had 2 days, we had 2 days. The time moved differently, slower and heavier. I spent those 2 days doing what Harold had told me to do. Real work on real things that needed doing. I cataloged every supply in the vault in complete detail. What we had, what condition it was in, how much of it. I packaged what was portable and organized it by priority. Food first, then medical, then tools, then reference materials. Harold's notebooks went into a waterproof bag, sealed. The photograph of Harold and Wallace went in there too. I wrote a full maintenance report for the vault systems. Generator condition, battery bank state, ventilation unit condition, water system condition. I addressed it, inside the front cover, to whoever came next. Because someone should, if the situation outside ever recovered enough, come back to this place and use what Harold had built. It was too useful to abandon. I wrote the propane levels down and noted that the 2 cylinders, even accounting for the months we'd used, still had enough to run the generator for a long time, if someone returned. I checked the speaking tube one more time, and I crouched near it, and I didn't say anything. I just stayed there for a while, thinking about Harold at this end of it, 30 feet below his own kitchen, building this thing with his hands, putting in the speaking tube so he could listen to what was happening above without being seen. Then on the morning of the second day, at 7:30 a.m., I heard footsteps above us, more than one person, moving deliberately, not the drifting wander of the infected. Then at the speaking tube, 3 nails and a plumb line. I said, coming up. Getting out was harder than getting in. The farmhouse debris had fallen partially across the concrete pad, but not completely. Harold's counterbalanced lid had held, and the debris around the pad edge had actually created a kind of natural wall that kept a clear space directly above the hatch. But there was ash and char everywhere, and the smell, when the outer hatch lifted, was the kind of smell that gets in your chest and stays there. Burned wood and wet ash and something else underneath it that I didn't want to identify. Tom went up first because his knee was the most limiting factor, and I didn't want him rushing. Then Mom, then Nora. I came up last. The farmhouse was a skeleton of chimney and foundation. Everything else was down. The stone chimney my grandfather had built stood intact in the middle of a field of gray ash, which struck me as exactly the kind of thing the world would do. Leave the part that didn't matter standing, and take everything else. The equipment shed was still there, untouched. The fire hadn't spread because the wind had been from the north that day, and the shed was south of the house. I stood in the ash of my grandfather's farmhouse, and I looked at what was left of it, and I felt the October air. We'd been down there through October and November and December, into January, which was what my marks said, on my face. Cold air, January cold. The sky was overcast, low clouds, the light gray and flat and even. The snow from a recent fall was still on the ground in the shadows, but melted off the open areas. There were 3 people standing a few yards from the vault entrance, watching us come out. 2 men and a woman, all of them wearing practical outdoor clothing, good boots, backpacks, alert and calm in the way people get when they've been living in a serious situation for a while and have developed a functional relationship with their own fear. The older of the 2 men stepped forward. He was maybe 55, broad-shouldered, close-cut gray beard, and he had that kind of stillness about him that some people have. Not absence of feeling, but everything settled into a single manageable layer. He extended his hand. He said, "Owen Garrett, I'm Ray Colton." I shook his hand. I said, "You know my name." He said, Harold told me about you, about your whole family. Said you were an engineer. I said, he told you about us? He said, he drove up to my cooperative in 2016. Said he'd built something on his property, and he wanted certain people to know it was there, in case the right circumstances came around. He described each of you. He said, he paused. He said his grandson was stubborn about things that mattered, and that was a quality he admired, even when it frustrated him. I didn't say anything for a second. I looked at the chimney. Then I said, who burned the house? His expression changed. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of tired recognition. He said, the group I warned about on the radio, Western PA Relief Cooperative. They're not what the name suggests. They've been targeting properties they know have survival supplies, eliminating potential competition or claimants. Somehow they identified this property as significant. I said, someone told them. He said, possibly, or they found a reference to it somewhere. Harold was careful, but he wasn't invisible. I thought about Wallace Pruitt's letter and the 3 archive sites for the material and the research facility in western Pennsylvania. I thought about whoever had received that information and what they might want to do about people who knew about it. I said, Ray, I need to tell you about what's in Harold's 3rd notebook. He looked at me steadily. He said, I know some of it already. Wallace Pruitt sent me a copy of the letter he sent Harold. He sent it to both of us. I said, then you know what this outbreak is. He said, I know what it might be. Whether it's exactly what Wally described, or whether it's something that evolved from that, or something entirely separate that would have happened regardless, I don't know. Probably nobody alive knows. But Wally was worried, and Harold was worried, and they were both careful men, and here we are. There we were. I looked at my mother, who was standing a few feet away with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, looking at the chimney of her house. She had her hand pressed flat against her sternum, which is what she does when she's holding something in. I went and stood next to her. I didn't say anything. She reached over and squeezed my arm. Once, without looking away from what was left of the house. After a while, she said, I'm okay. I said, I know. She said, I want to know why he didn't just tell us. I said, I think he thought we'd worry, or that we wouldn't believe him, or that if it never happened, he'd have scared us for nothing. I think he solved the problem the way he knew how, by building something instead of talking about it. She said, that's very him. I said, yeah? She said, I'm still going to be angry at him for a while. I said, that seems fair. Ray Colton's operation was 30 miles north, on roads that were nothing like the roads I'd driven in October. Not because the roads themselves had changed, but because the roads were different when you were moving through a world that had fundamentally restructured around a different set of facts. We traveled in 2 trucks. Ray's group had 3 vehicles total, all practical, all in good repair. No one drove carelessly or made unnecessary noise. The convoy moved at a pace that was deliberate rather than fast. Fast attracts attention. Fast means you miss things in your periphery. Fast is for people who are scared, rather than people who are managing. I drove Harold's truck, which had been sitting in the equipment shed for the whole duration. Tom sat in the passenger seat. Mom and Nora were in the back seat. Ray had given me a radio so I could stay in communication with the lead truck. The road conditions were what they were. There were abandoned vehicles in intermittent clusters, particularly through the town sections. Several structures had burned, not recently, weeks or months back. The char long since leached pale in the rain and freeze-thaw cycles. There were places where debris on the road required a slow route finding around the shoulder. And the infected were present, not in large numbers on the road itself. Winter had something to do with that, their responses slowing in the cold, their wandering patterns becoming more contracted. But they were there. You'd see them at a distance, individual figures or pairs, moving in that unmistakable way. Not fast, not coordinated, just present and relentless in that way that is the specific thing that makes them so horrible, which is not their violence but their patience. They have no impatience. They have no urgency. They just keep moving, indefinitely, toward whatever drew them, for as long as it takes. I watched them through the windshield as we drove north, and I thought about the simplicity of what they were. Whatever the material did, whatever the program had produced, whatever Wallace Pruitt had described in his letter, the result was something brutally simple. The higher function was gone. What was left was the lowest function. Move toward stimulus, act on contact. That was all. There was no planning in it, no cruelty, no intelligence, just a mechanism expressing itself. The man who'd burned my grandfather's house was more frightening than any of them, because that took decision and intent, and the ability to calculate that eliminating witnesses was in someone's interest. The infected were a natural disaster. The man with the dark clothes and the incendiary was a human problem, and human problems are the ones that don't have predictable parameters. Ray Colton's farming cooperative was not what I'd pictured from the name. I'd pictured something modest, a farm with some outbuildings, maybe a small community of people. It was considerably more than that. The main property was a 200-acre farm that Ray had been working for 20 years, and in the last decade, he'd been quietly expanding the infrastructure in ways that, reading between the lines of his description as we drove in, were clearly motivated by the same information Harold had received. The farmstead had its own fuel storage, a large propane tank, and a diesel tank. It had a greenhouse complex, 4 polytunnels and 2 glass greenhouses that had been expanded substantially in the past few years. It had a diesel generator large enough to run the whole operation. It had a water system drawing from both a well and a dammed stream on the east side of the property. And it had a perimeter fence, heavy-gauge farm fence on wooden posts, not electrified but solid, that enclosed the main compound. Inside the fence, 67 people, by Ray's count. 67. After 3 months underground with 3 other people, 67 felt like a city. The first thing I noticed about the settlement was the sound, not a loud sound. People were careful about unnecessary noise. They'd learned that early. But the ambient hum of a community. Tools, voices at a moderate distance. Someone working at a mechanical thing I couldn't see from where we parked. A child somewhere, which was the specific sound I hadn't thought I'd hear again, and which hit me at a level I wasn't prepared for. Ray showed us around in sections, methodically, the same way he'd done everything. He introduced us to key people. Deborah Winslow, who ran the medical operation, a calm, precise woman in her late 40s, who'd been an ER nurse before all this, and who clearly had the specific competence and the specific exhaustion that comes from being the person everyone relies on in a crisis. She looked at my mother's blood pressure medication situation with the focused attention of someone solving a problem and told Mom she'd be okay. They had a supply. Then Ray said, "Owen, I want to show you something." He took me to the far south corner of the compound, where a low concrete block building sat with its door padlocked. He unlocked it and opened the door. Inside was a shortwave station, a proper one, more transmitting power than Harold's receiver, a full antenna array on the roof of the building, a logging system with months of recorded broadcasts. And sitting in the operator's chair, turning when we came in, was a thin man in his 60s, with thick glasses and a close-cropped gray beard. He said, "You must be Owen." I said, "Yeah. And you are?" Ray said, "Owen, this is Wallace Pruitt." I stood very still. Then I said, "You're not dead." Wallace Pruitt almost smiled. He said, "Almost." The poor health I told people about it seemed prudent to become difficult to find. People who knew what I knew were having accidents. I stopped being easy to find about 2 years ago. I said, "Harold thought you might be dead." He said, "Harold and I were still in contact, through a system that didn't go through normal channels. He knew where I was, roughly. I didn't tell him specifically, because if they'd found Harold, I didn't want him to be able to tell them." I said, "He built a vault for us." He said, "I know." He told me, "Eventually, after you." He paused. He said, more gently, "After you were old enough, and he thought you'd take it seriously." That landed somewhere uncomfortable. He said, "He told me he'd tried to tell you once, that you'd been polite and changed the subject." I said, I was 26. He said, I know. I said, I wish he'd tried harder. Pruitt said, he thought you'd think he was crazy. He was afraid of that, specifically, with you. He said you were the most rational person in the family, and he didn't know how to explain this to someone who needed everything to make logical sense. I said, this makes logical sense. It always made logical sense. I just didn't have the information. Pruitt said, that's what Harold decided too, eventually. Which is why he put the third notebook in the wall. I sat down on the empty chair next to the radio desk. Pruitt said, he left you what you needed to understand it. He always said you'd figure out the rest. What I haven't told you yet about Wallace Pruitt, because I was still processing it when I was recording those earlier parts, is what he told me about the outbreak itself. He told me over about 4 hours, across 2 evenings, in the radio station. Quiet conversations while the radio logged its data and the settlement settled around us. The pathogen, he was comfortable using the word now, more comfortable than he'd been in the letter, was not something that had been designed to do exactly what it did. It had been developed as a neurological agent, one that was supposed to be more targeted and temporary than what it became. The containment anomaly in 2006 had released a modified version that had then, in the environment, over years, mutated in ways that the original program hadn't modeled for. What it became was more transmissible and more durable than anything in the original specifications. He said, what they made and what they were afraid of escaping are not identical. What got out is worse than what they were worried about. The mutation introduced faster symptom onset and higher transmission efficiency, and the behavioral component, the aggression, the biting, that was always part of the original design, because the original program was a behavioral modification agent, but it was never supposed to result in this degree of loss of higher function. I said, so they made something that could turn people aggressive, and then it mutated into something that also destroyed everything else. He said, simplified, yes. I said, why would you build that in the first place? He said, the stated purpose was to develop a reversible behavior modification agent for use in certain tactical situations, to produce temporary cooperation or temporary passivity in hostile populations. I said, to make enemy soldiers compliant. He said, among other applications. I sat with that. I said, and it's out of a facility in western Pennsylvania. He said, the facility has been destroyed. At some point in the early days of the outbreak, someone within the program, we don't know who, destroyed the facility and the records, probably to eliminate evidence. That was when I knew it was going to go as bad as it went, when they started destroying records instead of trying to contain it. I thought about that for a long time, about the people who'd known and destroyed the evidence, and how they'd weighed their own accountability against the survival of the world. I said, and the people burning properties and eliminating survivors, the Western PA Relief Cooperative. He said, connected to the program's history, not all of them, but the leadership has origins in the people who were responsible and want to make sure that no records survive and no witnesses establish a credible account of what happened. I said, Harold's third notebook. He said, is exactly what they're looking for. Yes. I said, then we need to make sure more people have copies. He said, I was hoping you'd say that. Month 5, which is now, which is where I am when I record into this little Sony voice recorder, sitting in the radio station at Ray Colton's farmstead, with 67 people living and working within the perimeter fence, and a greenhouse complex producing its first winter crops, and a medical station that Deborah Winslow is running, with the kind of focused competence that makes you feel like things are going to be okay. I've been here for 6 weeks, long enough to have settled into a role, long enough for the vault experience to be something I can hold at a slight distance, though not a large one. My engineering work here started on day 3. The well pump system had a failing pressure switch that nobody had been able to diagnose, and Ray mentioned it almost offhandedly, and I asked him to take me to the pump house, and I had it diagnosed in about 20 minutes, and fixed in about an hour. After that, the word got around that there was an infrastructure engineer in the compound, and the list of things to assess and fix and improve started accumulating quickly. I made a punch list. That's what we call them in engineering. A list of items to be addressed before a project can be called complete. Ray thought that was an interesting way to frame running a settlement. He said, "What's the project in your framework?" I said, "Surviving long enough to rebuild." He said, "Okay, what's the completion criteria?" I said, "I don't know yet. I think it might be the first time someone's born here who doesn't know what it was like before." He thought about that. He said, "That's a long project." I said, "Good thing we have a good vault." That made him laugh. It was a good laugh. Genuine. The kind that comes from someone who's been holding a lot and finds something genuinely worth releasing for a moment. Nora. I need to talk about Nora for a minute, because she's the part of this whole story I maybe get most wrong in my own head. I spent the first 17 or 18 years of her life thinking of her as my little sister, in the specific way that older siblings do, which is a combination of genuine love and a failure to fully register that she is an entirely separate person with her own complete interior life. She was Nora. She was mine, in the way family is yours. She was smart and sometimes irritating, and she made good grades, and she was going to be a doctor. Being underground with her for 3 months, and then driving north in Harold's truck, and then settling into the farmstead alongside her, did something to that picture. I saw her clearly, probably for the first time, in the way that intense shared experience reorganizes your perception of people you thought you already knew. Nora is competent in a way that isn't loud. She didn't announce when she figured things out. She just figured them out and acted on them. The infection transmission analysis she'd done at dinner in October, she'd been right. The caution she applied to the radio contact decision, she'd been right. The patience she had with my mother through the hard stretches of the vault period, not performed patience, genuine settled care. Deborah Winslow identified her immediately. 3 days after we arrived, Deborah pulled me aside and said, "Your sister is pre-med?" I said, "First year at Pitt." Was. Before. She said, "She's going to need to accelerate that." What Deborah meant was that the settlement needed medical capacity, and Nora was, at 19, already thinking and observing and prioritizing the way someone in their 3rd year of medical school would think. Deborah started working with her almost immediately. Not as a student exactly, as an apprentice in the actual sense of the word, which is someone learning a trade through practice, alongside someone who knows it. Nora is going to be a good doctor. She's going to be a good doctor in a world that needs them more than it ever has. Tom Aldridge. Tom is here too. He's become something that I didn't expect, which is useful. Not because he has specific skills that the settlement needs, though he's an organized and careful person, and those qualities are always useful, but because he taught school for 30 years. And what a community of 67 people rebuilding from a collapse eventually needs is an education structure. There are 11 children in the settlement, ranging from 4 years old to 15. Ray had been improvising on their schooling since the settlement formed. Tom has, in the past 6 weeks, organized an actual daily curriculum for the younger ones and a subject-focused program for the older ones. He does it with the same quiet competence he brought to sitting on a cot in an underground vault and reading every book Harold had stored. He asked me once, while we were both sitting in the radio station late in the evening, whether I thought things were going to get better. I said I thought so. He said, "On what basis?" I said, "Engineering basis. Systems find equilibrium. When a system goes badly out of balance, it generates corrective forces. The harder question is whether the equilibrium it reaches is livable." He said, "Harold thought it would be livable." I said, "Harold planned to survive it and built the vault on that assumption. That's a pretty strong vote for thinking there'd be something on the other side." He said, "You sound like you've made your peace with him." I sat with that for a second. I said, "I think I'm getting there. I'm still a little angry that he didn't try harder to explain, but I understand why he did it the way he did it. He was a man who expressed things through what he built." Tom said, "He expressed a lot." I said, "Yeah. The Western PA Relief Cooperative is still out there. I should be honest about that. The settlement has had 2 incidents in the past month, involving what Ray believes are scouts from that group. People observed approaching the perimeter in ways that weren't consistent with lost survivors looking for help. Both times, they were seen and moved off without confrontation. Both times, Ray increased the patrol schedule for a few days. Wallace Pruitt is carefully copying Harold's 3rd notebook and his own letter to Harold, along with a summary document that he and I have been working on together, explaining what we know about the outbreak's origin. Not in a way that's paranoid or conspiratorial, just factual. What the program was, what the facility was, what happened, what Wally saw, what Harold knew, what the timeline looks like based on the documented anomaly, and the onset of the first cases in Pittsburgh. When we have copies, we're going to distribute them. Not broadcast them, that would be reckless, but physically give them to trusted people in other survivor communities, so that no single location is the only place this information exists. Distributed knowledge is harder to eliminate than centralized knowledge. That was Wallace's idea. It was Harold's philosophy, applied to information. There's something I do every morning that I haven't mentioned yet. There's a corner of the farmstead's main barn that I've cleared out and set up as a workspace. Workbench, hand tools, a few power tools that we can run off the generator for specific tasks. I spend at least an hour there every morning before the rest of the day starts. I'm not always working on something specific. Sometimes I'm repairing equipment. Sometimes I'm building something the settlement needs. Last week it was a rack for the greenhouse irrigation connections. This week it's a tool organizer for the medical station because Deborah asked if I could make one. Sometimes I'm just in the space with my hands on something material and real, thinking. Harold told me to do this. He wrote it in the maintenance notebook. Work on real things that need doing. Find the real problems and fix them. I've been thinking, in those morning hours, about what I want the vault to become. Because the vault is still there. The farmhouse is gone, but the vault is intact beneath the debris, with the generator and the battery bank and the water system and most of the supplies, because we couldn't carry everything when Ray's group extracted us. The entrance is currently buried under burned debris, but it could be cleared. The systems could be restarted. The vault could function again. I think it should be a resource for the settlement, not a retreat for our family. We've moved past that. We're part of something bigger now, but a stockpile, a backup, a place with some specific supplies and systems that could support the settlement through a particular kind of crisis. Ray liked that idea. He said, "It's about a day's drive from here." I said, "Yeah." He said, "We'd need to secure the road." I said we'd need to secure the road, and we'd need to make sure the Western PA relief people don't find it first, because if they know the property and they burned the house, they may go looking for what was beneath it. He said, "When do you want to go back?" I said, "Spring, when the road's clear and we have more people to spare for the trip." He said, "Spring." He said, "We'll clear the entrance and re-inventory the supplies and document everything properly. Bring back what we can carry and leave the rest cataloged and accessible." I said, "And I want to put a notebook in there, a new one, from us, from what we learned." He said, "What would you put in it?" I said, "What Harold would have put in it if he'd known what actually happened. The truth about the outbreak. What Wally knows, the names of the people in the communities still surviving, how to find them, what they need, what they have. The kind of information that, if someone found the vault a year from now or 5 years from now, would help them understand what world they were entering and where to go." Ray looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Harold raised the right people." I said, "He built the right things. That's what he was good at." Last night I sat with my mother after dinner. The settlement has a communal space, an old farmhouse living room that's been opened into the barn by removing the connecting wall, creating a space that fits maybe 30 people comfortably. People gather there in the evenings, after the day's work is done. It has that specific quality that spaces get when they're regularly filled with people trying to be okay. Warm, slightly worn, permanently in the process of being made better. Mom was sitting near the wood stove, which is a big cast iron thing that keeps the space livable in the January cold. She had a composition notebook open in her lap, but she wasn't writing. She was just looking at it. I sat next to her. After a while, she said, "I've been thinking about writing something down. About Harold. About what I remember. Before I start forgetting things." I said, "What do you want to remember?" She said, "That he was more than I understood while he was alive. Not better or worse. Just more. He had a whole separate thing happening inside him that I never fully saw. He was worried for most of the last 20 years of his life, and he never let us see it, which I understand as a parent now that I couldn't have understood before. You protect your children from fear because fear takes up space in their lives, and you don't want it there. He thought he was protecting us." I said, "He was." She said, "I know, but I wish I'd known him better." I said, "Me too." She said, "I'm going to write it down. What I knew, what I'm only now understanding. Maybe Nora can read it someday, or Tom's students, or whoever comes after them." I said, "I think that's the right thing to do." She said, "Your grandfather would probably say we should build something instead of writing about it." I said, "I think we can do both." She almost smiled. She said, "He would not have agreed with that." I said, "He was always building something." She said, "All those years. The vault. This whole," she gestured vaguely outward, "at the settlement, at the world beyond it, at everything that Harold had somehow been aware was coming. All those years of building and planning and worrying alone." I said, "It worked. What he built worked." She said, "It did." She said, "I'm going to be angry at him for a little while longer, but then I'm going to be very proud of him." I said that seemed like a reasonable schedule. She laughed then, properly. The first time I'd heard her laugh fully since October. I want to close the record I've been keeping with something about the vault itself. Not about what happened inside it, or what it means, or what Harold meant when he built it. Something simpler. On the day we came out, while Ray's group was gathering our portable supplies and helping Mom and Tom get ready to move, I went back down the stairs one more time alone. I stood in the main room for a few minutes. The pine-paneled walls, the rubber floor mats, the shelving units with their remaining stores, the generator room with its hum and its gauges, the speaking tube outlet on the northwest wall, the empty brackets on the shelf where the notebooks had been. It smelled like processed air and propane, and the faint sweetness of old pine. It smelled like the 3 months we'd spent there. It smelled like the particular stillness of a space that has been attended, maintained, kept alive by someone paying careful attention to what it needed. I stood in the center of the room and I said, out loud, to nobody, "You did good." I don't know if I was talking to Harold, or to myself, or to the vault itself, which is a strange thing to say, I know. But I think when you spend long enough in a space, it stops being just a space. It becomes the sum of the attention paid to it. Harold had paid enormous attention to this space, and then we had. And together, that attention had kept 4 people alive through the worst thing that had happened in most people's lifetimes. I turned off the light on my way up the stairs. Not because I was abandoning it, because when you leave a space that's still going to be useful, you leave it ready, ready for next time, ready for whoever needs it. I pulled the inner door shut. I heard the bolt seat. I went up the stairs into the January light and pulled the outer hatch down behind me. Above me, Ray's people were moving and talking quietly. My mother was somewhere nearby. Nora was looking at her phone even though it didn't work, just out of habit, which made me smile, the way small absurdities make you smile when you've been through something large. Harold built a vault for us to survive in. We survived. Now we have to figure out what to build next. It's late now. The settlement is quiet, the way it gets after about 9 o'clock when people who are doing actual physical work all day don't have a lot of argument with an early bedtime. The wood stove in the communal room is banked down, just enough to keep the pipes from freezing. The perimeter patrol is doing its rotation. Deborah's medical station has its light on, which it always does. She keeps late hours. Wallace Pruitt is in the radio station, which he keeps running until midnight. He'll be logging frequencies and listening for the broadcasts that come in from the survivor communities we know about, and watching for the ones from groups we don't. It's careful, patient work, and he's very good at it. I'm sitting on a crate outside the radio station with Harold's voice recorder. The one he stored in supply bin 6, still in its packaging. I've been recording into it for months now, down in the vault and up here, and I'm running low on tape. There's probably 15 minutes left. I want to end this record the right way. My name is Owen Garrett. I'm 34 years old. I'm a civil engineer. My grandfather, Harold Garrett, built a survival vault beneath his farmhouse, and he knew something was coming, and he built it specifically for us, and he left instructions, and he trusted me to figure out the rest. I didn't listen to him when he tried to tell me. At 26, standing in the mud behind the equipment shed. I listened to him when it mattered, which was when his notebooks told me to fix the ventilation and check the propane, and work on real things, and trust the right people, and use the vault as a bridge, not a destination. He was right about all of it. I wish he was here. I wish I could sit with him at the Tuesday coffee group, wherever that would meet now, and tell him that the vault worked, and we made it out, and we found Ray Colton, and we're okay. I wish I could ask him what he was actually afraid of, in those years, specifically, and what it felt like to carry that knowledge alone for so long. I wish I could tell him that I understand now why he changed the subject when I was 26, and why he built the speaking tube, and why he put the key on the hook right next to the door, and why he signed the final instructions with his full name like a letter. He was the most deliberate man I ever knew. Everything he did was for a reason, even the things I couldn't understand until I needed to. I'm going to go back to the vault in the spring. I'm going to clear the debris and go down the stairs and sit at the table where Mom read his books and Nora wrote in her composition notebook and Tom ate crackers and I logged the generator gauges every morning. And I'm going to write the 4th notebook, the one Harold didn't have enough time to write himself. The one that says, "This is what happened. This is how we survived it. This is who helped. This is where to go. This is what's worth rebuilding. This is what it cost. This is what you need to know if you're finding this. And you're alone, and you don't know where to go." The kind of notebook that a machinist from Kittanning would have written if he'd lived to see his own plans work out. The kind of notebook that says, "I know things can go very wrong. I've seen it. Here's what I did about it. Here's what's left that's worth having. Here's what to do next." I don't know if anyone will ever need it. But Harold taught me something about planning for things you hope will never be necessary. You plan anyway. You build anyway. You put the key on the hook so nobody has to go looking for it. You write down what you know so it doesn't disappear with you. You make the spaces livable, not just functional. You include the coffee, even underground, even in a sealed vault 50 years after you expected to need it. You trust that if the right person gets to the bottom of those stairs, they'll understand what to do next. I understand what to do next. 3 nails and a plumb line. The tape's almost out. Signing off. Owen Garrett, formerly of Aldridge and Hollenbeck Infrastructure Engineering, Kittanning to Pittsburgh commute, complainant about 40-minute drives. Currently at Ray Colton's farmstead. Currently okay.